Hey, traveler. Tonight I thought we'd talk about how the Vikings survived the coldest nights of the year. Where are you in the world right now, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. It's wonderful to know where our fellow travelers are joining us from tonight. What would you do if the sun vanished for months? Imagine enduring a winter where daylight is a fleeting memory, where icy winds howl and the temperature plunges into the abyss. The Vikings faced this reality every year, and their survival was a testament to ingenuity, resilience, and a healthy dose of fatalism. It's not like they could just pop on a heated blanket and binge-watch Netflix, although, honestly, Thor probably would have loved Netflix. So, how did they do it? First, let's talk about shelter. Today, we crank up the central heating and complain if it dips below 70. But medieval people relied on structures that were surprisingly effective at retaining heat. The Viking longhouse wasn't just a communal space, it was a feat of engineering. Think of it as a really, really long insulated tube. The difference was, instead of fiberglass insulation, they used turf, wood, and a whole lot of mud. Sure, it wasn't exactly glamorous, but when your alternative was freezing to death in a blizzard, a muddy longhouse suddenly looked brilliant. They also kept animals inside, which, while not the most sanitary, provided additional body heat. Can you imagine trying to explain to your HOA why you need to keep a goat indoors? Key takeaway: Viking architecture prioritized warmth over aesthetics. Now that we've covered the architecture, let's talk about clothing. If you've ever worn modern thermal underwear, you have the Vikings to thank, indirectly. They understood the importance of layering. Linen closest to the skin, then wool for warmth, and finally animal hides for wind and water protection. This system trapped air and created a surprisingly effective barrier against the elements. The difference was that their thermal underwear was probably teeming with character. Sure, it wasn't exactly breathable, but when you're facing frostbite, a little bit of bioactivity is a small price to pay. Plus, they probably smelled worse than a locker room after a hockey game. Key takeaway: layers saved lives, even if they weren't exactly fashion-forward. Speaking of clothing, let's discuss the vital role of animal fat. Long before Vaseline, the Vikings understood the protective qualities of fat. They used animal fat to waterproof their clothing, protect their skin from the wind, and even as a primitive form of sunscreen. The difference was your Burt's Bees lip balm probably doesn't come straight from a seal. And, fun fact, Vikings might have had the softest, most supple skin on the planet, or at least the least frostbitten. Key takeaway: fat was a multi-purpose tool for Viking survival. But what good is a warm house and clothing without food? Food preservation was crucial.
They couldn't just run to the grocery store. Methods included smoking, drying, salting, and pickling. Think of it as a Viking charcuterie board, designed for survival rather than Instagram. The difference was your artisanal cured meats probably haven't been hanging from the rafters for 6 months. And the Vikings didn't have refrigerators, so spoilage was a constant threat. Sure, it wasn't always delicious, but when your alternative was starvation, slightly moldy fish looked pretty appealing.
Imagine trying to explain fermented shark to a picky eater. Key takeaway: Viking cuisine was all about survival, not taste. From food to fire, what kept the Viking longhouses lit and, more importantly, warm? Fire was central to Viking life, providing heat, light, and a focal point for social gatherings. They used various fuels, including wood, peat, and even animal dung. The difference was your fireplace probably doesn't require you to collect and dry organic fuel. Plus, I am sure that a Viking's fire pit could lead to some rather pungent evenings. Key takeaway: fire was the heart of the Viking home in every sense of the word. Now that we have discussed fire, we should also mention the importance of mental fortitude. This is a long, dark journey on these winter nights, and the Vikings faced long periods of darkness and isolation. Their sagas and mythology provided a framework for understanding the world and coping with hardship. Think of it as a very intense self-help book filled with gods, monsters, and epic battles. The difference was your therapist probably doesn't recommend raiding monasteries. And, let's be honest, the stories of Odin and Thor were a lot more entertaining than modern reality TV. Key takeaway: Viking mythology provided psychological resilience in the face of adversity. Hey, if you are still up, and I hope you are keeping warm out there, what about their sources of light? Long before LED light bulbs, the Vikings used simple oil lamps fueled by animal fat. These lamps provided a flickering, smoky light, enough to see by, but not exactly conducive to reading War and Peace. The difference was your reading lamp probably doesn't smell like rendered seal blubber. Plus, Viking lighting must have made everything look incredibly dramatic. Key takeaway: Now,
when you can
traveler, as the night deepens and the world outside grows still, let's continue our journey into the heart of Viking survival. Ever wonder how these Norse seafarers didn't just endure the long, dark winters, but actually built a civilization amidst the frost? Let's delve a little deeper. What would you do if your life depended on knowing the weather? Today, we glance at our phones for the forecast. But medieval people had to rely on observation and instinct to predict the coming storms. The Vikings were masters of reading the signs.
the flight of birds, the color of the sky, the feel of the wind on their skin. Think of them as the original meteorologists, except instead of radar, they had a deep connection to the natural world. The difference was your weather app doesn't tell you if Odin is angry. And honestly, getting a forecast from a raven probably isn't very accurate. Key takeaway: Viking weather forecasting was an art of survival, not just a casual check before heading out. Speaking of survival, let's talk about the importance of community. If you've ever felt lonely during a long winter, you know how vital human connection can be. But medieval people relied on each other for everything from warmth to protection. The Viking longhouse wasn't just a shelter. It was a communal space where families shared stories, tasks, and body heat. Think of it as a very long, slightly smelly, but ultimately supportive family gathering that lasted for months. The difference was your family probably isn't armed with axes. Sure, it wasn't always peaceful, but in the face of brutal winters, unity was essential. Imagine trying to get away with hogging the blankets in a longhouse. Key takeaway: Viking community was a lifeline in the face of winter's challenges. Now that we've covered community, let's consider the role of craftsmanship. Long before mass-produced goods, the Vikings crafted everything they needed by hand. They were skilled artisans, capable of creating tools, weapons, and clothing from raw materials. Picture them as the ultimate DIY enthusiasts, except their projects were crucial for survival. The difference was your IKEA furniture probably won't protect you from a polar bear. And frankly, a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead assembling flat-pack. Key takeaway: Viking craftsmanship wasn't just a hobby. It was a way of life and a source of resilience. But what good is craftsmanship without the resources to practice it? Picture this situation. Your survival depends on what you can gather and manage throughout the brief summer months. The Vikings had to be incredibly resourceful, storing food, collecting firewood, and preparing for the long winter ahead. They maximized every resource, from the smallest berry to the largest whale. Think of them as extreme preppers, except instead of a bunker, they had an entire season to prepare. The difference was your pantry probably isn't filled with fermented everything. I mean, who here has fermented shark in the fridge? Key takeaway: Viking resourcefulness was a constant battle against scarcity. From resourcefulness to resourcefulness within a community, let's think about the concept of trade. If you've ever bartered with a neighbor, you have some idea of how the Vikings lived. But medieval people relied on trade for goods they couldn't produce themselves. The Vikings were skilled traders, exchanging goods and knowledge. The difference was, your local farmer's market probably doesn't accept silver as payment. Sure, it wasn't always fair, but trade allowed the Vikings to access essential resources. Imagine trying to haggle for a better price on wool with a Viking wielding an axe. Key takeaway: Viking trade was a complex network of exchange that sustained their communities.
Speaking of long nights of survival, let's not forget their pets. What would you do if a blizzard trapped you inside for weeks on end? Today we have Netflix and video games. The Vikings had their animals. Dogs, cats, and even livestock were part of the Viking household, providing companionship and, in some cases, warmth. Think of them as furry roommates, offering comfort and a sense of normalcy during the darkest months. The difference was, your cat probably doesn't hunt seals. And, let's face it, a Viking dog probably wouldn't be impressed by a squeaky toy. Key takeaway: Viking pets were more than just companions. They were part of the family and contributed to overall well-being. Now that we've covered animal companions, it's time to consider the vital role of storytelling. Imagine a world without books or screens. How do you pass the time during long, dark nights? Medieval people relied on oral storytelling to preserve their history, entertain themselves, and teach valuable lessons. The Vikings were masters of the saga, weaving tales of gods, heroes, and monsters. Think of them as the original podcasters, captivating audiences with epic narratives. The difference was, your favorite podcast probably doesn't involve voyages to other worlds. Key takeaway: Viking storytelling was a powerful tool for cultural transmission and mental stimulation. But what good is storytelling without a little music? If you've ever sung around a campfire, you know the power of music to lift spirits. Medieval people relied on music for entertainment, celebration, and even religious rituals. The Vikings had their own musical traditions, using instruments like the lyre and the horn to create haunting melodies. Think of them as the original folk musicians, serenading the long nights with tales of adventure and loss. The difference was, your Spotify playlist probably doesn't include songs about Ragnarok. And a Viking concert would probably be a little more intense than your average coffee shop open mic night. Key takeaway: Viking music was an integral part of their culture and a source of comfort during the winter months. From music to mythology, picture this situation: the northern lights dance across the sky. The Vikings saw magic in the natural world, and their beliefs shaped their understanding of everything. What would you think if a magical display covered the sky? Today, we explain such phenomena through science. The Vikings, however, wove elaborate myths and legends to explain the mysteries of the universe. They personified the sun, moon, and stars, seeing gods and goddesses in every natural event. Think of them as spiritual interpreters, finding meaning and purpose in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. The difference was, your science textbook probably doesn't mention Thor's chariot pulling the sun across the sky. Key takeaway: Viking mythology provided a framework for understanding the world and coping with its challenges. Speaking of mythology, let's delve a little deeper into the importance of ritual. What would you do to honor the gods and ensure a Medieval people relied on rituals to appease the deities and maintain balance in their lives. The Vikings had their own religious ceremonies involving sacrifices, feasts, and prayers. Think of them as active participants in a cosmic drama, constantly striving to maintain harmony with the divine. The difference was, your Sunday service probably doesn't involve animal sacrifice, and a Viking prayer probably included a request for victory in battle. Key takeaway: Viking rituals were a way of connecting with the divine and ensuring the well-being of their community. Now that we've covered ritual, let's consider the role of mental fortitude. If you've ever faced a difficult challenge, you know the importance of mental strength. But medieval people faced hardships that we can barely imagine. The Vikings had to be incredibly resilient, enduring long periods of darkness, isolation, and scarcity. Think of them as the ultimate survivors, facing adversity with courage and determination. The difference was, your therapist probably doesn't recommend raiding and pillaging as a coping mechanism. And, modern reality TV isn't exactly as enthralling as the prospect of Valhalla. Key takeaway: Viking mental fortitude was a key ingredient in their survival strategy. But what good is mental fortitude without hope for the future? If you've ever planted a seed, you know the power of believing in tomorrow. Medieval people relied on hope to sustain them through difficult times. The Vikings, despite their often brutal lifestyle, had a strong belief in the future. They valued family, community, and the continuation of their traditions. Think of them as optimistic realists, acknowledging the challenges of life while still striving for a better tomorrow. The difference was, their vision of the future involved sailing to new lands and conquering new territories. Key takeaway: Viking hope was rooted in their values and their determination to build a lasting legacy. And let's consider the impact of their legendary seafaring skills and naval engineering. Imagine having to build the boat you need to survive. The Vikings were master shipbuilders, crafting vessels that were both seaworthy and beautiful. Their longships allowed them to explore new territories, trade with distant cultures, and, yes, conduct raids. Think of them as the ultimate naval engineers, designing ships that were perfectly suited to their environment and their needs. The difference was, your cruise ship probably doesn't have a dragon head on the prow. Key takeaway: Viking seafaring prowess was a defining characteristic of their culture and a key factor in their success. From the seas to the skies. What would you do if you saw a rainbow? Think of how the Vikings interpreted such wonders of nature. The Vikings believed that the rainbow connected Midgard to Asgard, the realm of the gods. Think of them as those who saw the connection between all things and the bridge to new beginnings. The difference was, you will not find Vikings chasing after the end of the rainbow for gold. Key takeaway: the Vikings understood the connectivity of things and took great notice
traveler,
as the night deepens and the stars begin to whisper their secrets, let's continue our exploration of how the Vikings conquered not just lands, but the chilling embrace of winter itself. What would you do if you needed to stay awake for days on end? Think of pulling an all-nighter. Now imagine doing it when your survival depended on it. Medieval people sometimes had no choice, whether standing guard or nursing the sick. The Vikings, known for their long voyages and arduous tasks, were no exception. They didn't have coffee, energy drinks, or even the luxury of electric light to keep them going. So how did they manage? The answer lies in a combination of natural stimulants, disciplined routines, and sheer willpower. But hey, at least they didn't have endless emails to answer at 3 a.m. The difference was, a Viking probably wouldn't understand the concept of binge-watching to stay awake unless it involved a truly epic saga recited over several days. Key takeaway: Viking wakefulness was a matter of survival, not just productivity. Now that we've covered the need to stay awake, let's talk about clothing. If you've ever shivered in the cold despite wearing layers, you know that not all clothing is created equal. Medieval people relied on natural materials like wool, linen, and animal hides to protect themselves from the elements. The Vikings were particularly adept at crafting warm and durable clothing from these resources. Think of them as the original outdoor gear specialists. They layered tunics, trousers, cloaks, and hats to trap body heat and block out the wind and snow. The difference was, your high-tech thermal underwear probably wasn't spun by hand and blessed by a shaman. And let's be honest, no matter how stylish your winter coat is, it probably doesn't boast quite the same level of ferocious warrior aesthetic. Key takeaway: Viking clothing was a crucial defense against the biting cold. Speaking of clothing, this brings us to the question of textiles. But what good is warm clothing without the means to produce it? Long before department stores, medieval people had to grow, process, and weave their own textiles. The Vikings were skilled in all aspects of textile production, from raising sheep for wool, to spinning yarn, to weaving cloth on a loom. Think of them as self-sufficient fashion designers, except their designs were dictated by necessity rather than trends. The difference was, your washing machine probably won't sing a Norse ballad while it's spinning, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead wearing polyester. Key takeaway: Viking textile production was a labor-intensive but essential skill. From clothing materials to food preservation, picture this situation. Your survival depends on what you can store and preserve. If you've ever canned or frozen food, you have some idea of the challenges faced by medieval people. But the Vikings didn't have refrigerators or freezers. They relied on methods like salting, smoking, drying, and fermenting to preserve food for the winter months. Think of them as master chefs of preservation, except their cuisine was dictated by necessity rather than culinary creativity.
The difference was your favorite kimchi recipe probably doesn't bury it in the ground for 6 months, and a Viking probably wouldn't understand the concept of sell-by dates. Key takeaway: Viking food preservation was a vital art for surviving the lean months. Speaking of food, let's consider the importance of hunting. If you've ever hunted for your own food, you have some idea of the skills and knowledge required. But medieval people often relied on hunting to supplement their diets, especially during the winter.
The Vikings were skilled hunters, pursuing animals like deer, elk, boar, and even seabirds. Think of them as expert trackers and marksmen, except their success meant the difference between survival and starvation. The difference was your hunting rifle probably doesn't have runes carved into the stock, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead using a GPS to track their prey. Key takeaway: Viking hunting skills were essential for procuring food during the harsh winter months. But what good is hunting without a proper shelter? Imagine trying to build a house using only materials you can find in the wilderness. Medieval people relied on their resourcefulness and ingenuity to construct shelters that could withstand the elements. The Vikings built longhouses from wood, stone, and turf, creating structures that were surprisingly warm and durable. Think of them as master builders, except their construction projects were a matter of life and death. The difference was your building permit probably doesn't require a sacrifice to the gods, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead living in a McMansion. Key takeaway: Viking shelter construction was a testament to their resourcefulness and skill. Now that we've covered shelter, it's time to consider the vital role of fire. What would you do if you had no electricity and needed to stay warm and cook food? Medieval people relied on fire for everything from heating to lighting to cooking. The Vikings were masters of fire-making, using flint and steel to ignite tinder and build roaring fires in their hearths. Think of them as pyrotechnic experts, except their fires were essential for survival, not just entertainment. The difference was your lighter probably doesn't require the blessing of a fire god to work, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead using a gas stove. Key takeaway: Viking fire-making skills were indispensable for surviving the winter. Speaking of fire, let's not forget about lighting. Imagine trying to navigate a world without electric lights. Medieval people relied on candles, oil lamps, and torches to illuminate their homes and streets. The Vikings used tallow candles made from animal fat, and oil lamps filled with fish oil or seal oil to dispel the darkness. Think of them as illumination engineers, except their lighting solutions were a necessity, not a luxury. The difference was your LED light bulb probably doesn't smell quite as pungent as burning seal oil, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead using a flashlight. Key takeaway: Viking lighting skills provided a crucial sense of security and comfort during the long nights. But what good is lighting without the stories to share in its glow?
If you've ever gathered around a campfire to tell stories, you know the power of shared narratives. Medieval people relied on oral tradition to preserve their history, entertain themselves, and pass on valuable knowledge. The Vikings were masters of storytelling, weaving sagas of gods, heroes, and monsters that captivated audiences for generations. Think of them as the original bards, reciting epic poems and tales that resonated with their listeners. The difference was your audiobook probably doesn't involve as much beard stroking and dramatic gesturing, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead reading a romance novel. Key takeaway: Viking storytelling was a cornerstone of their culture and a vital source of entertainment during the winter months. From stories to songs and celebrations, picture this situation. The winter solstice arrives, marking the shortest day of the year. What would you do to celebrate the return of the light? Medieval people marked the solstices and other seasonal festivals with feasts, rituals, and games.
The Vikings celebrated Yule, a midwinter festival honoring the gods and the return of the sun. Think of them as party planners extraordinaire, except their celebrations had deep religious and cultural significance. The difference was your office holiday party probably doesn't involve sacrificing a goat to Odin, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead at a New Year's Eve ball. Key takeaway: Viking celebrations provided a sense of community and hope during the darkest time of year. Speaking of celebrations, let's delve a little deeper into the importance of games and recreation. If you've ever played a board game or sport, you know the importance of having fun. Medieval people relied on games and recreation to relieve stress, build camaraderie, and pass the time during long winters. The Vikings played games like Nefatafel, wrestled, skied, and ice skated. Think of them as athletes and gamers, except their activities were often tied to survival skills and warrior training. The difference was your video game probably doesn't involve as much physical exertion, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead playing Candy Crush. Key takeaway: Viking games and recreation provided a much-needed escape from the hardships of winter. Now that we've covered games, let's consider the role of spirituality. If you've ever found comfort in your faith, you know the power of belief to sustain you through difficult times. Medieval people relied on their religious beliefs to make sense of the world, cope with adversity, and find meaning in their lives. The Vikings had a complex system of beliefs centered on Norse mythology, which featured gods, goddesses, and supernatural beings. Think of them as religious scholars and practitioners, except their beliefs were often intertwined with magic and ritual. The difference was your meditation app probably doesn't involve chanting runes to summon Thor's blessing, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead questioning the existence of the gods. Key takeaway: Viking spirituality provided a framework for understanding the world and finding solace in its mysteries. But what good is spirituality without the tools to heal and care for the sick? Imagine you are sick. What would you do? Medieval people relied on herbal remedies,
folk medicine, and magic to treat illnesses and injuries. The Vikings used a variety of plants and herbs for medicinal purposes, as well as charms and spells to ward off evil spirits and promote healing. Think of them as medical practitioners and healers, except their methods were often based on trial and error rather than scientific knowledge. The difference was, your doctor probably doesn't prescribe crushed beetle wings for a headache, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead playing a placebo. Key takeaway: Viking healing practices, while primitive by modern standards, provided a crucial sense of hope and comfort during times of illness. And, last but not least, let's think about their legacy. What if the world remembered you for your ability to not only survive, but thrive? The Vikings did just that. Their seafaring prowess, craftsmanship, and cultural richness left an indelible mark on history. They not only survived the coldest nights of the year, but they built a civilization that continues to fascinate and inspire us today. The difference was, the Vikings didn't have Google to record their works. Key takeaway: the Vikings adapted to their environment and created a lasting legacy. So, as the first hint of dawn kisses the horizon, remember the Vikings. They were not just fierce warriors. They were adaptable survivors, skilled artisans, and resilient human beings. They faced the challenges of the cold and the darkness with courage, ingenuity, and a deep connection to their community. And in their stories, we can find inspiration to face our own challenges, big or small, as we begin a new day.
Chapter 4. Hey, Night Owl! As our Viking saga nears its end, and the first glimmers of dawn threaten to steal our shadows, let's ponder how the Vikings handled something we all dread, death and the afterlife. If you've ever wondered what happens after we shuffle off this mortal coil, you're in good company. Medieval people, including the Vikings, were equally fascinated and terrified by the prospect. But the Vikings didn't just ponder, they actively prepared for their journey to the next world. Think of them as the ultimate preppers, except their survival kit included a long ship, a sword, and maybe a few mead-soaked friends. The difference was, your retirement plan probably doesn't involve being greeted by Valkyries, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead in a beige casket. Key takeaway: Viking beliefs about death shaped their entire lives. Now that we've pondered death, let's talk about burial practices. Speaking of preppers, what if all your stuff went with you? If you've ever cleaned out a deceased relative's home, you know the sheer volume of possessions people accumulate. Medieval people, including the Vikings, believed that the dead needed their earthly goods in the afterlife. So, they buried their loved ones with weapons, tools, jewelry, and even animals. Think of them as the ultimate you-can't-take-it-with-you paradox, except they literally tried to take it with them. The difference was, your retirement plan probably won't be greeted by Valkyries, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead in a beige casket. Key takeaway: Viking burials were elaborate affairs that reflected their beliefs about the afterlife. Speaking of burial practices, this brings us to the question of rituals.
But what good is burying someone with their stuff if you don't do it right? Long before funeral homes and memorial services, medieval people had their own ways of honoring the dead. The Vikings performed elaborate burial rituals, including funeral pyres, ship burials, and grave mounds. Think of them as event planners for the dearly departed, except their events involved fire, boats, and maybe a bit of human sacrifice. The difference was your eulogy probably won't be delivered by a skald singing an epic poem, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead with a generic store-bought sympathy card. Key takeaway: Viking burial rituals were deeply symbolic and culturally significant. From burial rituals to social structure, picture this situation. Your place in society dictates your fate, even in death. If you've ever felt like you were being judged by your social status, you're not alone. Medieval people, including the Vikings, were highly stratified societies. Your social status affected everything, from your clothing, to your diet, to your burial. Think of them as the original social climbers, except their ladder was made of swords and longships. The difference was your LinkedIn profile probably doesn't mention your lineage back to Odin, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead kissing up to the boss. Key takeaway: Viking society was hierarchical, and your place in it determined your destiny. Speaking of social structure,
Key takeaway: Viking women played a vital, often underestimated, role in their society. But what good is social status without the laws to govern it? Imagine trying to maintain order in a society without rules and regulations. Medieval people relied on customary laws and legal codes to resolve disputes, punish crimes, and maintain social order. The Vikings had their own system of laws, called law speakers, who memorized and recited the laws at public assemblies. Think of them as human legal databases, except their source code was written in runes. The difference was your lawyer probably uses a computer to look up legal precedents, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead arguing with a law speaker. Key takeaway: Viking law was based on custom, tradition, and the power of persuasion. Now that we've covered law, it's time to consider the vital role of trade and commerce. What would you do if you needed to acquire goods and services that you couldn't produce yourself? Medieval people relied on trade and commerce to exchange goods, ideas, and technologies. The Vikings were skilled traders, traveling far and wide to acquire valuable commodities like silver, slaves, and exotic goods. Think of them as the original global merchants, except their supply chains involved longships and raiding parties rather than cargo planes and container ships. The difference was your Amazon delivery probably doesn't involve a Viking longship pulling up to your doorstep, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead paying full price for anything. Key takeaway: Viking trade networks connected them to a vast world of goods and opportunities.
Speaking of trade, let's not forget about raiding and warfare. Imagine trying to survive in a world where violence was a constant threat. Medieval people often engaged in raiding and warfare to acquire resources, expand their territory, and defend themselves from enemies. The Vikings were notorious raiders, striking fear into the hearts of coastal communities throughout Europe. Think of them as shock and awe specialists, except their shock and awe involved axes, shields, and a lot of screaming. The difference was your home security system probably doesn't include a Viking berserker guarding your front door. And a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead backing down from a fight. Key takeaway: Viking raiding was a brutal but effective way to acquire wealth and power. But what good is raiding without the ships to carry you? If you've ever been on a boat, you know the importance of a well-designed vessel. Medieval people relied on ships for transportation, trade, and
Key takeaway: Viking navigation skills were essential for their voyages of exploration and conquest. Speaking of navigation, let's delve a little deeper into the importance of exploration. If you've ever felt the urge to explore the unknown, you share a common bond with the Vikings. Medieval people were driven by curiosity, ambition, and the desire to find new resources and opportunities. The Vikings explored vast stretches of the world, from North America to Russia, leaving their mark on the cultures they encountered. Think of them as interstellar pioneers, except their spaceships were longships and their destinations were earthly rather than extraterrestrial. The difference was, your space exploration program probably doesn't involve raiding foreign planets, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead settling for a boring 9-to-5 job on Earth. Key takeaway: Viking exploration expanded their horizons and shaped their identity. Now that we've covered exploration, let's consider the role of cultural exchange. If you've ever traveled to a foreign country, you know the impact of encountering different cultures. Medieval people interacted with a wide variety of cultures, exchanging goods, ideas, and customs. The Vikings were particularly influential in this process, spreading their language, religion, and art throughout Europe. Think of them as cultural ambassadors, except their diplomatic toolkit included axes and swords as well as trade goods and stories. The difference was, your international conference probably doesn't involve a Viking longship pulling up to the venue, and a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead eating sushi. Key takeaway: Viking cultural exchange enriched both their own society and the societies they encountered. But what good is cultural exchange without the art to express it? Imagine a world without music, painting, sculpture, and literature. Medieval people relied on art to express their emotions, beliefs, and values. The Vikings created a rich artistic tradition, including intricate carvings, ornate jewelry, and epic sagas. Think of them as artistic geniuses, except their art was often functional as well as beautiful. The difference was, your modern art gallery probably doesn't display Viking longships alongside abstract paintings.
And a Viking probably wouldn't be caught dead trying to interpret a pretentious art critic's explanation of a sculpture. Key takeaway: Viking art reflected their unique worldview and cultural identity. And last but not least, let's think about their lasting impact. What if your actions resonated through the centuries, influencing the course of history? The Vikings did just that. Their seafaring prowess, warrior culture, and artistic achievements left an indelible mark on the world. From the languages we speak to the stories we tell, the Vikings continue to fascinate and inspire us today. The difference was, the Vikings didn't know how far their impact would go. Key takeaway: the Vikings weren't just passing through. They changed the world. So, dear traveler of the night, as the world outside begins to stir and the darkness yields to dawn, our journey through the Viking world comes to an end. We've explored their homes,